From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. On today's Blue Sky episode, we're going to talk about loss, death, and grief. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you listening are wondering why this subject would be discussed in the studios of the Optimism Institute. The answer is that death is a fact of life, and as our guest today will explain, grief is a complicated process that varies greatly by the circumstances and the person doing the grieving. It's my belief that the better we're able to understand all of this, the better able we'll be to live a healthy, hopeful, and optimistic life. My Blue Sky guest, Meghan Riordan Jarvis, is a psychotherapist, author, TEDx speaker, and host of the podcast, Grief is My Side Hustle. A specialist in trauma, grief, and loss, she's the creator of the Grief Mentor Method, which helps people adjusting to loss create personalized, grief-informed daily practices. She's also the founder of the Grief-tastic Book Fair, which she says with a wink is like your middle school book fair, only sadder. She's also a board member for the Went Center for Loss and Healing and the New Normal Foundation. Meghan is the author of Can Anyone Tell Me? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss, as well as End of the Hour, a therapist's memoir about her personal experience with PTSD after the deaths of her parents. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Meghan Riordan Jarvis as much as I did. Meghan Riordan Jarvis, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Phil, thank you so much for having me. This is just a delight.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. I feel like I know you very well, even though I don't know you very well, because I have read your incredible memoir, End of the Hour, a therapist's memoir. And before we get into the meat of that book, I'd love to just talk about where did you get your interest in psychotherapy? How did you come to this profession?
Yeah, I mean, I even love the way you say it because my reaction is like, oh, no, I have no interest in psychotherapy. No, I didn't even know anything about therapy when I was growing up. It was just not a world that I knew about or really understood what it was. It sounded like it was a thing for people who were, sick in their minds. And I went through what I thought at the time was the world's worst breakup, the kind that people write novels and songs about, which I now look back and I'm like, nope, that was just a normal breakup. But at the time, it was really hard for me to recover from. And I had just moved down to DC and had sort of like a new cluster of friends. And this is really honestly what drove me to therapy. What drove me to therapy was I was sitting with this lovely group of people and recounting for the 865,000th time the details of the breakup and how confusing they were and how hard. And I could sort of see people's eyes sort of ping-ponging to each other. And I was like, oh, I am exhausting their tolerance for this conversation. But my tolerance for this, I can't even not talk about it. And an older colleague said to me, she found me like crying in the bathroom. And she said, I think you should go see a therapist here. And at that point, I didn't take it as criticism, like you're doing something wrong and you need help. She said, I think you might, I think this woman who I also see might be helpful. And I walked into therapy really like with just impressions of what it looked like on TV. And that's not what it was. I mean, it was not that. It was something else. And at the very end of that very first session, I was like, oh, how will I survive without this great love? My life is over. I've broken up with someone. And the therapist said, did anything bad ever happen in your childhood? And I was like, oh shit, this lady's not listening. Like she wasn't even listening to all the real things I just told her. She just asked a totally, non sequitur kind of question. And I answered it by saying, like, no, nothing bad ever happened in my childhood. And then I went home because that's what I believed in that moment. Like, nope, I had a loving family. We grew up together. So lucky to have 5 brothers and sisters. And I went home that night and I was like watching TV and I was like, oh, well, except, that teenager who was really beloved by my family and everyone in my small town drowned while my family was on the beach and nobody noticed. I wonder if that's what she could possibly mean. And so I went back to the second session and said, like, hey, this is what happened. And she was like, yeah, I knew something happened. And I was like, wait, tell me how you knew something happened. And she said, well, you told me in that first session that you have a harder time with X, Y, and Z, including recovering from a breakup, than you think most other people do. And that is the hallmark of a kid who had trauma in their childhood. And I was like, oh, lady, tell me more. Like, what other magic do you know about me? And that really began, I lost what I thought at the time was the great love of my life, but I found a new love of my life, which was this notion that you could understand what drove your feelings and behaviors. And in fact, sort of drop what didn't maybe apply anymore because I wasn't 9 anymore, and even expand by doing things differently.
How old were you when this happened? When you had this first?
I was
therapy?
9. I
No,
was
no,
9
I'm sorry
when
for
the death happened.
the first therapy
when I
session.
first walked into therapy, I was 23, and I'm 51 now.
So you're 23. So you were thinking about your career and lots of other things, but it was being a patient in therapy that you said, this is something I'd be good at and would like to do.
Yeah, I mean, I did another thing, which is really traditional for children who grow up maybe underparented and with some chaos. I achieved a lot in a short span of time. So I went to college and got out of college with a master's degree when most people were walking out with just a bachelor's degree. And that master's degree was in early childhood education. So every year that I was in college, I was teaching in a classroom. Well, and so I was never going out to keg parties because I had to get up at 7 in the morning and be around like 6-year-olds. So by the time I graduated with that master's degree, I was sort of like, I don't actually love teaching. I like kids, but I don't like their parents. And I'm not sure this is I've been pursuing this thing, but I don't know why. And my younger brother was at Georgetown at the time, and I came down to visit him, and I had more fun in one weekend than I had had in my entire college career. And I was like, well, I'm going to move to DC. And I was in DC I feel like this is helpful, like in the Monica Lewinsky era of DC. So at the time when we had our first government shutdown and suddenly the government was being run by, 22-year-olds, I was offered a position as a campaign manager. I mean, I'd only ever been a teacher. And somebody was like, oh, I like your resume. You could be my campaign manager. And I was like, what about me makes you think I could do that job? So I was down in DC and I had this relationship that fell apart very quickly by the time I got down here. He wasn't here, but it all fell apart. And I had no direction, which is a wonderful, wonderful time in your life to start therapy.
Gotcha. So in your book, you describe you were a therapist for quite some time, treating patients with all manner of challenges, including grief. And then in fairly close succession, you lost your father who had been sick, and I've been through it. It even the expected passing is still difficult. But then the unexpected passing just a couple years later of your mom. Can you describe what happened to you next and what had been missing in your own training about grief and what the surprises might have been for you to be experiencing it firsthand?
So part of what I have to say is that the reason I write about the early childhood trauma in the book is because it really informs my response to my mother's death, which is the way trauma works. It kind of, even when you've healed it, you don't erase it. So it still lives like sort of splinters or dye inside your system. So when my dad died, my dad had small cell cancer. He knew he was dying. I knew he was dying. And I love my dad, but I was not close to my dad. He was not an easy guy. And so the year that we had while he was dying, and even to some degree his death, which was hard and painful, it all sort of stayed in the threshold of the lines, right? Like it stayed in what I knew to expect and what I understood in my experience in life, but also in my clinical experience. The people I treat that come to see me are the people who I became when my mom died. So people who are not functioning, who aren't sleeping, aren't eating, who suddenly don't really understand if life has any meaning anymore, who are, tearful, and that, although in my world we often diagnose that around timelines, I don't agree with that. I think it's more, I find it simpler to diagnose when you look at the symptoms and the intensity of the symptoms. And that's more like traumatic grief. And that traumatic grief is really destabilizing. And that is what happened. My mother died suddenly while I was on vacation with her. She'd had a short illness that was essentially like a really bad stomach ache, went to sleep, and then didn't wake up. And I feel like it's important to say my mother had the most beautiful death possible. She had just seen all of her family members, which is not easy when you have 6 children. Her brother, who she only saw like once every couple of years, she had visited with her beloved Monsignor in her neighborhood, was wearing her favorite pajamas, holding her rosary, went to sleep, didn't wake up. But the reason I say that is because she had the most beautiful death, the one that I would have scripted her if I could have. And still, I was totally dysregulated and completely spun into a moment of chaos. And largely for me, that showed up as a rumination. So a rumination is just like a circular thought that you can't get your head out of. And that rumination happened the minute my husband called me to tell me she died, was that it was my fault that she died. And I mean, honestly, Bill, I still believe that sometimes, that it was my fault. And that's just the way that I describe this, like, that's a mentally ill thought that I live with. I know logically it's not true, but I believe it sometimes.
It wasn't until Meghan Riordan Jarvis was 23 years old and asked by a therapist to talk about her childhood that she understood the significant trauma she'd experienced when her family was on the beach while a local teenager drowned. This opened her eyes to the power of therapy, and her interest was sparked. She had practiced as a psychotherapist for many years before her own mother's death sent her into a major stretch of grieving, and realized that this loss turned her into one of the people she treats. She writes extensively and openly about all of this in her terrific memoir, The End of the Hour. And for more on that, let's get back to our conversation. And you do such a nice job in the book, and I give you a lot of credit because you really put it out there and what you went through.
I go all the way.
You go all the way. No, but and you wind up going to a trauma center, inpatient trauma center, a place where you had been referring patients.
Yeah.
And I wondered as I was reading if, as you were going through that, were you even thinking, oh my gosh, I do this for a living and it's happening to me? Or were you just so gone? So I would think it almost makes it worse in a funny way.
Oh, I was furious. I was so furious. So I did have this like metacognition, like this other part of me that was the clinician the whole time. Like the minute the rumination hit me, I was like, oh man, this is bad. Like I knew from my clinical experience, like I'm not going to outrun this. And then when what you're looking for is like, oh, well, she didn't sleep last night, so let's look at her sleep tonight. I was going from sleeping 4 hours to sleeping only 20 minutes. So I knew I was, by the time in the book, I call a colleague Susan. And by the time I call her, like I knew what I would say to me, which is like, you got to go to an inpatient. You need more, it's like when a baby isn't eating, like you can try a bottle but at some point they need intravenous feeding. Like I needed all the interventions possible, and I did know it. And I got to tell you, I was so mad about it because I liked the way my dad's death landed with me. It was hard and it was sad and it was a little disruptive, and I did some intensive therapy to sort of process it out. And I was like, oh, good, it all works. But it turns out that getting overly educated in something does not mean that you get to, circumnavigate the actual experience of your own loss. So that was deeply humbling. And it was similar to like, if you study France from a book and they're like, it's filled with pastry shops and mountains and whatever, like you can have an idea of what it's going to be like. But then you go to France and you're like, oh my God, salted butter on a warm baguette. Like it is a sensory experience. So the other thing that I felt while I was in treatment was like, oh my God, my people have been telling me about this for years. And there's just no way to understand. There was no way to understand until you embody it yourself. And then I kind of, I've had other people say this to me. I kind of wanted to make phone calls and be like, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, right.
If I wasn't as helpful,
Right.
I would do a better job now because I get it differently now.
It seemed to me though, we as a culture, we draw this big line between physical health and mental health. And for some reason, we think that mental health should be something, well, you're trained and you should be able to fix it. Whereas if an oncologist got cancer, you don't say, wow, how could an oncologist get cancer? Well, they get cancer. Versus you might say, well, how could a counselor have so much trouble with grief? That's what she does, right? Is that something that we should get over and stop like making this huge distinction?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the questions that people will ask me, I have a book talk tonight. Someone will ask at this book talk, they'll say, how do I know when I should go see a therapist? And how I always answer that question is there's a bias in there that you believe that you shouldn't, just in the way you're asking the question, right? Because you would never say like, how do I know when I should go to an orthopedist? Like you would just go. You would never ask yourself like, do I deserve it? Do I need it? So there's this ongoing, it's not just mental health, but there is this ongoing component of like grief and loss, which I think is driven by a lot of things. But I will be really honest that I think some of it falls sort of in the sort of social justice component of things, which is like, we don't support people and we don't support them in this vulnerable place, which is utterly predictable. When I'm talking to corporations, I'm like, listen, everyone that runs your company is like 48 to 59. Every one of those people is going to be burying their parents in the next 10 years. So what are you doing? Like, how are you supporting them? And they have all these supports for young families. They don't have any. And I'm like, but these are the people you want to keep. And the statistics are 51% of people leave their jobs after a profound loss. 51% of people leave their jobs in a year because they're not well supported. So I think it's both things. I think, I had a CEO say to me one time, I don't really believe in that mind-body connection. And I was like, do you believe in gravity? Like, I don't need you to believe in it, first of all, for it to be real. But also, have you ever been nervous when you're about to go give a speech? That's the mind-body connection. And if you don't believe in it, it's probably because you didn't pay good enough attention in your like biology class in 8th grade. There's something called the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve that literally takes electrical current information from the brain down into the body and from the body up into the brain. So when people say they're separate, they're not separate. They've never been separate. What are you talking about? They've never been separate. So I think there's this shaming component because it seems like a kind of a weakness. I think people think of grieving as like a form of failing. And the thing that I always equated to is like, it's much more like adolescence. You wouldn't look at a kid who woke up in the morning and had like acne all over his face and was super moody. You wouldn't be like, wow, you are really failing at being a teenager. You would say your hormones are out of whack because you are growing at this crazy pace. It's actually good for you and necessary. The acne will not be here forever. And I'm so sorry you have to go to school like this. And to some degree, grief is a lot like that, which is like, look, you'll sleep again. You will. You'll be able to eat again. You'll get your feet underneath you about what matters to you in the world, but it's going to take a minute. And here are some interventions, right? There are some amazing little dots that you can put on pimples now that did not exist when I had Clearasil, which looked like, toothpaste. So my teens are, they're out in adolescence in a way that I couldn't have been. And that's what I want for grief and loss, which is, listen, if I can teach people, here are the typical symptoms brain fog, memory loss, not being able to eat, not being able to sleep, brittle nails and hair. It's all the 12 systems in the body. Your respiratory system. So you have panic attacks, your digestive tract, your reproductive tract, all kinds of things that get impacted by the trauma. And then people a year later, when they're still not able to sleep or they still have migraines, and they come in and they say, well, my doctor sent me to you because they can't figure out what's wrong with me. And I say, well, what happened a year ago? It's not even a smart question. They say, well, my dad died, but I don't think it has anything to do with it. I need them to know it has something to do with it because it's almost like they're wasting time. And it's like ice freezing across a windshield. If you don't interrupt it, it gets worse. It gets worse. Sleep patterns get worse.
It's interesting to hear Meghan say that when she was struggling with intense grief after losing her mom, that she knew what was happening to her, but still couldn't do anything about it. She goes on to add that just because you're educated on a subject doesn't give you control. And something I particularly appreciate is her practical approach to getting better grief services to more people. In this segment, she talked about businesses that give all kinds of support to employees with young families, but don't consider the fact that their older workers will be dealing with aging and dying parents, and that these challenges can be significant. Now, let's get back to our conversation. So this is the point in the conversation where people are probably might be wondering, I thought this podcast was about optimism. We're talking about death
and such bleak stuff.
So let me tell you why I think it is, and you tell me what you think. So there are very few things in life that we are all going to experience. We're all born, we're all going to die, and if we're lucky to live long enough, if we're lucky, we're going to lose a lot of people we care about. How can we make the most of that, or at least, I don't want to say the best of it, I guess the least bad of it, understand it as natural, like you said, because it seems to me that a healthy understanding of death and its reality, and it's going to happen to me, and it's going to happen to my parents, and it's going to happen unexpectedly to people I really care about. The healthier you can be about death, the better your life is going to be while you're alive. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And that actually is where I land. So I run this book festival in LA, which is called the Grieftastic Book Festival. And it's super irreverent and it's really funny. And it's people who have all been through profound loss, who are the authors. Every one of them I laugh harder with than I laugh, with my average friends. Part of what all of us know is that grief and loss is a transformative process, that you don't go back to who you were because that is not possible. And there's a period of time, and I call this fresh grief. People call it different, but it lasts. It lasts longer than you think. It can be 3 years or 5 years, but it's a while. It's longer than we want it to be, where you feel a little bit like, well, I'm not who I was before, but I don't know who I am yet. And there's I'm becoming this griever and I don't know what the meaning of my mother's death is going to be. If you had asked me in those first weeks, hey, do you think you're going to write 4 books related to grief and loss? I'd be like, are you crazy? I can't even read the English language right now. But that is what's happened. And so for most folks, there's the trauma, the terrible thing that happens. There's the period of time where you're traumatized by it. So your life is kind of limited by that event. What we don't want to do is remain traumatized, meaning we only stay limited. What we're always looking for, and this is where David Kessler's work in finding meaning, what we're looking for is the traumatic growth, which really means the change. How did you change? Not just from the loss, but also from remembering all the love and attachment. So, I went from being a therapist who worked with individuals and small groups in my office to being somebody who doesn't go a week without talking to a crowd of several hundred at a bare minimum, and being on podcasts, saying to folks, listen, I know we have you convinced that there's nothing we can do to help you in grief and loss. And that is a load of horse crap. We can teach you how to go into yourself and come out the other side with a personalized grief practice. We give you these 6 components and we say, let's focus on them. We teach you how to focus on them. But it's really not that different if you said to me, oh, well, I unexpectedly am going to have to run a marathon and they want me to run it today, but I'm not in any shape. Be like, okay, well, let me tell you how we can get your body in shape to run a marathon. It's going to take a minute. That's what grief work is. And we, as a trauma therapist, I teach that to people. I teach them 6 components. We're going to focus on these 6 areas. What your Aunt Sally says is good for her is not necessarily going to be good for you. So you can't borrow someone else's. You got to do this little experimentation, but you absolutely can create a process that you can have a daily grief practice, which you need because everyone that's ever come to see me in my office as a therapist, they get 50 minutes with me, but then they have 23 extra hours of that day that they still have to be able to carry their grief. So we teach these tools. And then people go out and they say, wow, I've become a painter, or I've discovered that cleaning is my absolute best tool when I'm in my grief space. And we have all kinds of, funny ways. One thing that we talk about is like the grief EpiPen. So what do you do when you're somewhere and all of a sudden you have the equivalent of a very bad allergic reaction to some stimulus? What do you and so one of the first things we create with people is the EpiPen. So for me, I call these 3 people and they say to me, "You're okay. It's all right. You're going to." So I use connection. But some people use headphones and music, and other people would go for a run. But the reality is the EpiPen is we need to change the physicality of your system right away. And we teach all this. We teach it and people will say to me, it can't be done. And I'm like, that's fine if you believe that. I do it all day long.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's so much there. I think my sense is a lot of this dealing well with something like grief is, first of all, just understanding that it's normal. The book, What to Expect When You're Expecting. I remember we have 2 kids and it's a huge bestseller. And what I found from that book is it's mostly like, oh, this weird thing's happening. And then you read a chapter, it's like, oh, that happens to other people. And then you just relax. It's still a weird thing, whatever it is, but then you relax. And I think, one time when I lost my father, I remember getting a lovely note, and I've used this in other condolence letters I've sent. And this person said, please do what you can to take the time you need to grieve. And sort of the idea that society expects us to, quote unquote, get back to normal or get back to work or whatever. And it's like, no, losing your parent is not a normal everyday experience. You are not going to snap back and be back at work Monday, your old self. And just knowing that, and like, oh, I'm not the only one who feels like I'm driving in the breakdown lane and everyone's going 80 miles an hour past me. Oh, right. So that's a lot of it, I think.
Yes, but what's tricky about it is, when I ask this question, I put people on the spot in huge audiences, many of whom are therapists. And I say, what does it mean to grieve? What is grieving? How do you define it? And people generally, you get past sort of like crying and they don't really know what constitutes grieving. And so I love a note that says, take the time that you need to grieve. But many people think that means take the time to cry. And then when you're done crying, come back to work. But it's the grief process, the verb of grieving is what we have people do is we have them connect to their physical system so that you can take cues from your system. We teach them a lot about the differences between the 2 energetic forces in our body. So there's a sympathetic nervous system, which adds energy. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms you down. We talk about what nourishes you because for a lot of people, they kind of only eat banana bread when they're grieving and they forget that they used to love to read poetry or that they used to take walks in nature. And so and then we talk to them about how do you tell your story? What is it that you say happened? Because we define our lives in words. And if I say to you, my mother was really sick and she died and I wasn't paying any attention, I will live that. Right? That's the reality of like, oh, I am responsible. So we get really clear about language. It's called the grief mentor method that we use. And then we make sure that we get people outside, the outside being outside physically because it's really good for us to be out in nature. It's good for our central nervous system, but also you have to go outside your immediate support system because you're changing. And so your needs for people to get what it's like to have a dad die are going to be different than they were before. And it's really unfortunate. Lots of people fall away because they don't know what to do with you. And it's unfortunate, but it's normal. It happens. It happens.
They don't know what to say. They see you in the grocery store and it's been 2 months since your dad died, but they haven't seen you. And do I say something? And then, like you said, what's your story? So knowing parents who have lost children, you meet a stranger on an airplane or something. Oh, so you have kids? How many kids do you have? How do you answer that? Do you answer with the number you had before you lost? There's things like that, and talk about, triggers or hearing a song that you associate with that child, or it's just, there's a lot of that.
One tool that we teach people is something called finding your five. So a 0 is your sleep and a 10 is your having a panic attack. And the idea is you want to be able to talk about your grief experience, your traumatic event, whatever it is. It could be that you got divorced. It could be that you got fired. It could be, but you want to be able to connect to other people without that pushing you like to a 2 where you need to fall asleep now with so much effort, or to an 8 where you have a panic attack and you're talking in this defensive, crazy way. And what we talk to people about is it's amazing. You get to experiment with it. So when someone in the line at Starbucks says, "How are you?" you can say, "My son died 3 years ago." And just see how it goes. You don't know that stranger or anything. How did that, but it's not about the rest of the world. It's about how did it go for you? How did you feel about that sentence that you said? How are you living into the story? When my mom died, it was probably 10 days I was in treatment before I could even tell. People would say, "What happened? What are you doing here?" And I'd be like, I just couldn't even say it. I couldn't believe it, and so I couldn't say it.
It's helpful to hear Meghan describe the loss of a loved one as a true form of trauma. And turning to the optimistic and hopeful side of these hardships, she says that these events can provide an opportunity for traumatic growth. Grief, she also says, takes many forms, and for all of us, it involves a whole lot more than crying. Now back to my conversation with Meghan Riordan Jarvis.
So part of what we do when we're teaching people how to grieve is we say, we know all these things are hard. One of the things we teach them, and this is with my other book, Can Anyone Tell Me? One of the things that we teach them is there are 12 physical systems in the body. You don't remember them from your 8th grade bio class. We're going to tell you what they are. And they are things like your reproductive tract. They are things like your digestion, your skin, your nails, and hair are all one system. And then we say, and your respiratory tract. And we say, can you check in on all 12 of your systems this week and be curious about whether or not grief is impacting them? Your vascular system, your muscular skeletal system. You know how many people I treat that regularly throw their back out or regularly have, muscle pain in between their shoulders by their neck? And they say, I don't know why it is. But it's actually, we can just tell you why it is, because the body holds energy in its muscles as grief.
Not to mention heart attacks,
right.
Broken heart syndrome.
There's Mary Frances O'Connor, who's an incredible researcher and a good friend of mine. She just published a book called The Grieving Body. And the statistics in that book around heart attacks will knock your socks off, particularly for men who have recently become widowers. They are at a 3 times more likely to have a heart attack in the first 48 hours, 3 times more likely after their partner dies. And they're at double the rate of, their significance for up to 18 months after their partner dies, which means having your partner die is a risk factor. It's a cardiovascular risk factor.
Totally.
Right. Which is stunning. And I think most people don't know that. Most doctors don't know that.
Well, speaking of most doctors don't know that, one of the things that surprised me in your book was describing that really, you're not really taught much about grief, even when you're becoming a psychotherapist. It's sort of like when you talk to MDs and they're like, we don't take nutrition at med school. It's like, really? So you've talked about that. And then you also gave a TED talk about why don't we teach this in like school, like grade school, middle school. We talk about the birds and the bees awkwardly, and we do some of these other things. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you very excitedly that this fall I am teaching a curriculum to high school juniors and seniors
No way.
at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, which is where I went to high
No
school.
way.
So I
Is this breaking news? Am I
It is
breaking news
breaking
here on the Blue
news.
Sky
I mean, I'm
podcast?
ecstatic.
All
They
right.
have been unbelievably generous. I'm working with their health department and their religion department. And for 40 minutes, 3 days a week, these kids are going to learn about grief and loss and death and dying, which is extraordinary. But it is, again, if you think about like what are the life skills that we actually need and where can we possibly get them? I mean, I always laugh at like, I was living in an apartment by myself when I was 25 years old and I knew how to make like a quesadilla. I knew how to iron, but like I don't, the concept around grief and loss to me has much more significance. One, as you said, everyone's going to go through it, but two, there's a chapter in Can Anyone Tell Me where I really talk about the people who are the most vulnerable to the traumatic loss. So the folks who are really maybe going to fall out of life the way I had to fall out of life. I was 21 days away from my family and friends, which, there's been some, I think, fair criticism of my book, which is like, look, most people don't have the privilege where they can take 21 days out of. And what I say is like, you're not really mad at me for being able to get the treatment I needed. You're mad that the world. But the real privilege that I had in that moment is that I understood that I was sick. That was the real privilege. And that I knew the phone numbers that I could call to get treatment and help. The problem is therapists, pastoral counselors do have a requirement, but therapists in general, so people who have PsyDs, social work degrees, counseling degrees, marital counseling degrees, they are not required and often not offered a single class on grief and loss. I took one when I was in graduate school, and it was a video. It was like a movie that we watched and then talked about like, wow, it's sad when people die. So therapists are not really genuinely, they're not qualified. And grief and loss symptoms are similar to depression and similar to anxiety, but they're not the same because depression and anxiety sort of show up maybe without a lot of precipitating events. It's almost like a storm system that moves in, but grief and loss anxiety comes only because you just lost something you don't believe that you can live without. And so the treatments are really different. And so we don't have treatment. It's super expensive. It's very difficult to find even when you know the names of the people who are supposed to be able to. It's not required for therapists to be qualified in it. So often people are going to therapy without realizing that this person doesn't really have the qualifications to treat them. And the people who are at the most risk of being traumatized are folks who have, and I talk about the ACEs score, they have had a number of hard things in their childhood already exist. And so I really think the fact that we don't expect our society to carry the burden for the people and alongside the people really puts at an extreme disadvantage people who are already disadvantaged. And we know that they are. So in my mind, I work with companies and I'm like, look, this is an incredible, I'm often called into companies because they've had a sudden loss, someone died. And I say, this is really awful and tragic. And about 3 months from now, we're going to do different work where we're just going to teach everyone in your cohort how to think about being a supporter of someone who is grieving, because that will be every single one of us. And what the feedback I get is like, it is wholly different. If your mom dies, you're out of work for 5 days, which is the maximum most people get. You go back to work and you know that everyone in your work environment was trained in this grief model. And so they have some kind of wisdom that coming back to work feels total. Even when people make mistakes, and they inevitably will, it feels completely different in that workplace.
That's amazing. Meghan says that we have 12 systems in our body and that they all can be affected by grief. People who've been through the grieving process can likely remember or continue to experience the effects that go beyond just the mental or emotional but extend to very basic physical functions. And those are some lucky high school students who will be able to learn from Meghan about this important subject. And I can imagine how much healthier an organization can be when the people who work there have been trained in how to handle their own grief as well as that of their coworkers. Now to the final segment of this Blue Sky conversation with Meghan Riordan Jarvis. You have a podcast with one of the great podcast titles, which is Grief is My Side Hustle. So you're taking this message, if you will, to the masses. You've talked a lot about, we just mentioned the workplace. Can you say a few things about how we, as currently not in the depths of grief, but have a friend, coworker, what are the, people worry, what should I say? What shouldn't I say? Can you give just a couple of sort of quick tips on, you've got someone you really care about and they're going through this, and how can I be a good support ally, if you will, to them?
Yeah, I mean, some of the work that I love the most is when families and communities call me and say, we've had a loss in our community and we want to be as wonderful as possible to the folks that are here. So one thing that I say is don't work alone. Call other people. So, there's usually a community of people around someone. So don't work alone, because your good idea may be the antithesis of what someone else thinks is, or what they need, right? Like the number of times people are throwing food away because two different people put together everybody knows we need food, and now all of a sudden they have a literal, I've seen this, a literal refrigerator on the front stoop because there's too much food. But to see if there's a way to sort of collect and have a conversation that goes from point zero, when the event happened, to a year out. And so a year out minimum. We're not talking about a couple of weeks. I want you to plan for a year. And so work backwards. What is it that you think people might need a year out? Well, they're probably going to need someone to help them with their Christmas lights because it's going to be okay. Let's assign who's going to do that a year from now. And who's going to be asking them if they still need food a year from now, and who's going to be putting together resources and therapy. And the thing is, people feel like they need to be able to say the right thing. And I don't know what to say either, by the way. And I don't really want to walk over to my neighbor who just lost his dad either. So it's hard no matter how much education you have. But if you're part of a planning team, you get to offer what it is that's true for you. Nobody wants me bringing a lasagna. I am a terrible, terrible cook. But I will take your kids for the weekend to Six Flags, and I'll bring them home exhausted with good memories. So you also want to show up with something that's authentic to you. And one of the things that's always true is that, you can care more about someone's experience than you actually are connected to them. That happens a lot. I am heartbroken for this woman in my community who lost her children in this car accident. I have only spoken to her twice. So it's better for me to be part of a coalition of people and then offer what I'm going to come in the fall and I'm going to plant tulips in her yard so she at least has flowers because she has such a beautiful garden. I'm going to offer that. And that feels like the right distance. So being part of a coalition, I think, is really important. And then if you are worried, what am I going to say? Ask questions. And I don't mean, how are you? But are you sleeping? Are you able to sleep? Are you finding anything that's helpful? Are you able to read? Is there TV that's distracting for you right now? Have you had relatives come in from out of town? Just all the things that are you back to work? And the thing is, if the person doesn't want to talk to you about it, it's easy to see that when you ask a question. They'll say, "Meh, I'm back to work," but and then you can feel it. They don't want to talk about it. They heard you, and you should always. And I will tell you, even people who've lost parents 8 years ago, if I haven't seen them in a long time, when I can remember, and I really always try, I will say, "Oh my God, I'm so glad to see you. I was just thinking about you because I saw Carol Burnett on TV and it made me think of your mom." Because we all want our people remembered to us all the time.
Totally. And I'm so glad you mentioned the 1 year too, because until you go through it, you don't realize in that year, the person you've lost is going to have a birthday. They might have, Christmas is coming or whatever holiday you care about, Mother's Day. these things, it's like one after their wedding anniversary. There are these markers. The day they died. My sister and I, we call it the death anniversary of our dad. It was October 26th.
The death anniversary. Yeah. And it doesn't get better necessarily after a year. It's just the person usually has more agency to express what it is that they want. I mean, we ask grievers, we say, you tell me what you want. And they have no idea what they want because to them, they're in like a black alley in it with an overpass and a train. Like they're so disoriented, they don't know where they are. So saying to them, like, should I bring you a lasagna? Like, I don't know. Is a lasagna going to help me in this dark alley where like all I can hear is some terrifying noise? So we do better to sort of do a lot of planning, and then that griever can opt out. Hey, I'm going to come over and I'm going to weed your garden. Is that cool? 7 months after the person died, hey, I'd love to come and weed your garden. But putting it a year out, we do not mean to forget. But most of us are the leading men and women in our own story, and our lives are really full. So I have my own stresses at the holidays. So I need my phone to remind me, check in with Brenda. I need it to do that. And when I'm working with companies, the companies love that. They have a calendar. They love being reminded, hey, this is going to be a hard time for these 12 employees because they had a loss in this last year. After a year, the employees, we can kind of expect them to say, guys, I really loved that last year. Don't do that again this year, though. I don't want that this year. They can participate more and have, I think, a little bit better sense of what may be helpful to them.
Amazing. So Meghan, you've got so many different ways to help people. Let's quickly review them as we get near the end of our time. End of the Hour, A Therapist's Memoirs, the book I read. I absolutely loved it. Highly recommend. You also have a book, Can Anyone Tell Me, which is, I think, I haven't read it because I always disclose I don't pretend I've read a book when I haven't, but it feels maybe a little bit closer to what to expect when you're expecting, right? In terms of
exactly, that's how it's been described.
Okay, good. And then you've mentioned a few times, grief is your side hustle, is my side hustle, greatest podcast title ever. And then you've mentioned working with corporations. How can someone, if they're in a company running a business, how can they access you and your offerings?
Yeah, so we have 3 different ways that we help grievers. One, and if you go to our website, it says help for the helpers, help for the griever, help for the leaders. So if you're interested in having us come in and do some professional development, which I would highly recommend because there's a lot of stuff going on inside workplaces that people don't understand is actually about grief and loss. And a lot of it's been lingering since COVID. So people love the offerings that we do, but you can just come on the website, click on the part that you're interested in and send us a note. And for the grievers, I do some classes, some online classes. I have a lot of stuff through my Instagram that I offer, including book fairs and, book talks. I'm doing one tonight. And then help for the helpers is we train clinicians in the grief mentor method. And I do a lot of in different retreat centers like Omega and Kripalu and other spots. We do some experiential where we teach you the grief mentor method and then we let you experience some of it, right? So it's like, would you like to play tennis? Well, I don't know. Okay, well, we're going to put a racket in your hand and we're going to have you think about your grief and we're going to see if whether or not that feels supportive. So come onto the website and you can send us notes. I have a great little team of people who furiously answer all those things, or come find me on Instagram. I'm pretty responsive and I tend to answer those myself.
Fantastic. Meghan Riordan Jarvis, you're giving a great gift to the world with your work. And it's been such a pleasure getting to know you through your book and now talking to you for this episode. I can't thank you enough for taking this time and for all the great work you do.
Thank you, Bill. This has been such a delight. I'm really grateful.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Meghan provides more great advice here when she says it's important not to work alone when helping someone with grief, and that we should plan for a year out. We've all seen instances where well-intentioned people reach out and help in the first days and weeks of someone's loss, only to trail off once we might think it's time to move on. It's also important and reassuring to hear what she says about all this being very hard, no matter how much training you've had. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Meghan Riordan Jarvis, and that it will help you work through the challenges of grief whenever you, a friend, or a loved one is faced by them. Before you go, we'd appreciate you leaving us a rating or review. These help us keep making our shows better, and they make it easier for new listeners to find us. While you're at it, you might want to subscribe to Blue Sky wherever you get your podcasts, sign up for the Blue Sky Weekend newsletter at theoptimisminstitute.com, and follow us on social media. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. And all graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.